Hello and welcome to our followers. This is a feature produced by Association for Consumer Rights Malta. And today, as guest and expert, we have Prof Yousif, who is an associate professor at the University of Malta. Good morning, Prof Yousif.
Good morning, and I'm very happy to be with you today.
Thank you for accepting this invitation to give us an overview of solar panels. We got quite a few questions from consumers about wanting information about what to look for, what solar panel system is exactly composed of. So I leave it with you to, in this short feature, give us an idea of the various components and their characteristics these days within a system.
Thank you very much. So a solar system that is widely used in Malta and abroad is what we call the grid connected system. This is mainly made up of photovoltaic panels. Now, these photovoltaic panels could be of different types, of varying efficiencies, not much. We will talk about that in a minute. An inverter that changes the DC voltage to AC voltage to be able to connect to the grid, and some switches for safety features, as well as a frame that you can put up on the roof or on a wall to support the PV panels. So here I can show you quickly some types of PV panels. The first one we have here is a 30-year-old PV panel. You can see the degradation, the discoloring, and so on, but they are still amazingly working in a very well conditions, with 60% of their output being still in action. This is a shiny PV panel. As you can see, this is called multi-crystalline silicon cell, while this one that you see here, it's a matte black one, and this is a monocrystalline silicon cell. The efficiency difference between mono and polycrystalline is in the order of 1 to 2%, very, very little. And the last one is what we call the thin film type PV panel. And this type is not very popular because its efficiency is much, much, much lower than the polycrystalline silicon cells. When I say much lower, it's like 50% lower. So it's not popular in Malta because we don't have space for it, and therefore we only look for polycrystalline or monocrystalline silicon cells. The last thing that came up on the market is that the PV panel can be bifacial. That means it produces energy from the front, but also from the back. The problem of the back is that it needs some diffuse radiation, solar radiation, that is reflected from the roof on the back to produce energy. And therefore, one has to be careful about that. If you buy a bifacial PV panel, you need to see how you are going to install it. If you install it horizontally or on a wall, of course, it will not produce anything extra when compared to a normal panel. So one has to be careful about that. And the last addition nowadays is the battery. If you install a battery with your PV system, then you will need to make sure that you understand why you are putting this battery in. And one of the reasons why batteries are coming in is because we want the grid to suffer less when the PV electricity is fed into the wires of the grid, being that if in a certain area you have many PV panels feeding into the grid, then the grid suffers certain disturbances. To avoid that, you need batteries, and the batteries are there so that in the morning, when the energy consumption in the house is low because everybody is working from their offices, the energy from the sun is charging the batteries rather than feeding into the grid, and therefore the grid remains stable. So these are different features and components that one can consider for a PV system.
You had also explained to me that a battery has the convenience that if you need to use something at night when you come back home, you have the energy you generated in the morning when you weren't home, you can use it at night. And
Sure.
if the grid goes out, the national grid has a failure, then you also have some backup in the battery. I liked that concept. I don't have a battery yet because my solar panels are almost 12 years old, but I liked that added security that you had explained to me.
Yes, there is added security, but added expense and lower generation of solar energy. Why? Because the battery has its own efficiency, and therefore you lose roughly 10 to 15% of your energy generation when compared to a system that feeds directly into the grid. Having said that, it doesn't mean that you should not install a battery, because it has this added feature of having your own energy production and security. Therefore, even if the grid cuts, you will have energy for your essential needs for a number of hours, depending on how large is the battery. One important thing that one needs to understand is that you do not have to install the batteries from day one. You can today opt for an inverter, which we call it hybrid inverter. That means it can connect to the grid, but also connect to a battery. And with that hybrid feature, you can operate the first few years as grid-connected PV system, and eventually when you decide to install a battery, you do not need to change the inverter. So that is the added feature of thinking about a hybrid inverter from day one. And one has to also remember that if you have batteries, you really need to discharge them. You really need to use them. You can't just say, okay, the battery is charged, I will keep it charged and I will only use it twice a year when the electricity cuts off. Because if you don't charge and discharge the battery, the lifetime and the age of the battery drops very fast. So it needs to move in this cycle of charging, discharging every day. So in other words, those 10% that you will lose from charging and discharging the battery, once you have a battery, you have to accept the fact that you will need to lose that in order to prolong the lifetime of the battery.
I see. That's worth keeping in mind, because after having bought a battery, it would be a pity if we don't use it in a way that will save its life, keep its life going. Lastly, with regards to the frame, because I believe that is the fourth component.
Yes, the frame can come in two types, steel, galvanized steel, or aluminum frame. If it is aluminum frame and the panels are usually made up of an aluminum frame, then installing an aluminum frame on with an aluminum PV panel, there will be no problem with expansion and contraction due to the temperature and due to the overheating of the sun. But if your frame is made of steel and all the PV panels are made of aluminum frames, then there will be a discrepancy between the aluminum expansion and the metal expansion. Usually, we try to separate those two from each other, either by installing an aluminum beam between the metal frame and the panels to take up this change in expansion. Why do we care about that? Because this micro difference in the expansion rate of steel and in the expansion rate of aluminum can create what we call micro stresses inside the solar cells. And those micro stresses by time can create micro cracks that you can't see with your eye, but will deteriorate the PV panel fast. So we try to keep the PV panels as much as possible free from mechanical stresses. And one of those mechanical stresses is when you put the PV panel or you tie it to a product, to a frame that is of a different material.
I see. Just to go back to the heart of the solar panel, so that we would have given it the attention it deserves, this heart of the system. Should I go for a single inverter? How do I decide on a single inverter or an inverter for each solar panel?
Yeah, here I can show you one single inverter, microinverter we call it. It can connect to one or two panels. This is another type, which we call DC optimizer. Also, it is quite light and it connects to one or two panels. Those we use them usually when you have partial shading on your roof. In order for the panel, the shaded panels, not to impact negatively the other panels, we tend to use separate inverters for each panel. But if your roof has no shading issues, then of course it is cheaper and more efficient to use a single inverter similar to this one, which we call a string inverter. It's basically made up of electronics and those power electronics that convert the DC voltage to AC voltage and essentially can feed into the grid or into a battery. It is reliable. It has been on the market for many, many years. And in fact, many systems, as long as you don't have partial shading on your roof, opt for these string inverters.
Very good to know about the criteria that help us decide whether to go for single or a multi-inverter system. And so this brings us to the conclusion of this first feature about solar panels. Thank you, Prof Yousif. And I thank the followers of this feature and look forward to answering more consumer questions in upcoming features with you, Prof Yousif. Once again, thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you very much.